Well, good morning, everyone. John assures me I don't require an introduction. I don't know if that's indicative of my being old or what, but nonetheless, I'm delighted to be here and to continue with you our study of the canon of the contemporary Irish writer Claire Keegan. During Advent, we read small things like these, and in the final discussion of that novella, we discussed how Keegan, as a wordsmith, conducts what might be referred to as a verbal arabesque or a verbal tour de force in her treatment of the word legitimate. When Bill Furlong is born, given the conditions of his birth, by this collusion between church and state, he is defined as illegitimate. His identity is circumscribed for him by this collusion. And in the final scene, when Bill and the young girl arrive at the threshold of his home, the final sentence reads, and I quote, "In his foolish heart, he not only hoped, but legitimately believed that they would manage," unquote. And we see how Keegan, as a wordsmith, takes the word legitimate and its variant, illegitimate, and in a tour de force, turns that word on its ear, you might say, and how in the end, he legitimately believes that he and his family will manage. We see that same linguistic effect, if you will, in the novella Foster. In this novel, she invites us to consider the word foster multivalently, multifariously, to imagine it as an extended metaphor or a metaphysical conceit, the same effect that she achieves around the word legitimate. And what we shall see is that she takes us back into the genesis of the word foster as it enters the English language. And what we discover by this etymological research is that the word foster means food. And so the question then becomes, what is the nourishment? If we think of foster multivalently, what is actually nourished on the different levels as we consider this novel? Keegan describes the story as a long, short story. Critics also tend to refer to it in the subgenre of prose as the novella. But what I'd like to consider first is just what a rather curious, circuitous path this work of prose took before it becomes published for us as American readers. The story was published first in America in the year 2010 in the New Yorker, but in an abridged version. Later that year, in the United Kingdom, Faber and Faber published the entire novella. But Keegan's editors at Grove in America were quite hesitant to release the full unabridged version so closely after the abridged publication in the New Yorker. And so her American editors decide that they will wait until her next work comes out and then they will bring Foster in its complete form. Well, we had to wait for 12 years because it was 12 years later that Small Things Like These would be published. And it was as recently as last November in the fall that Grove decided that we would now have in its full form Foster. It had been 14 years since Keegan had published a book in the United States. And what this means is that there is an entire generation of readers and booksellers who did not know her. Morgan Intrican, who is from Nashville and is her publisher for Grove, describes her as a stonecutter and says she doesn't work quickly. And I think that's such an appropriate figuration to use to describe her as a writer, her craft. She's a stonecutter. She doesn't work quickly. She chisels in the very difficult medium of the human condition, replete in all of its textures and contours and imperfections. She has chiseled, she has inscribed in prose what has been referred to as a master class in child narration. One of the great gifts of Foster is that she demonstrates her virtuosity in creating the perspective of a different protagonist, from Bill Furlong now to a young, unnamed girl whose age we know not. We know very little about her. She is referred to as the child. She is referred to as Girleen, long legs, and on 3 occasions she is referred to only by John Kinsella as Petal. That is his private term of endearment for her. But Keegan has demonstrated for us just her own virtuosity in imagining the perspectives of different narrators. And this analogy of the stonecutter, what she has done in chiseling this novella is to really liberate the narrative from the stone. I remember Michelangelo, whose wet nurse was the daughter of a stonecutter of the Carrara marble. And he always believed that by virtue of imbibing her milk, that is how he would become a sculptor. And he always said of the Carrara marble, the image was already there. He merely liberated it by chiseling away the outer surface. I think the same effect is relevant in the consideration of the craft of Claire Keegan, that she takes this story and she holds it very tenderly. She holds it in a very tentative way and liberates it and brings it to us as readers. She says of her work that it is often pared down. And she says that as she writes, she gives very little thought to length. She is not writing to a page number. She is not writing to a word count. What pleases me, according to Keegan, is brevity. Her stories, she says, begin when a single image gets lodged into her imagination, an image that assumes residency within her imagination. And in the case of Foster, it is a zinc bucket, a young girl seeing her reflection in a well. That was the image that assumed residency within her creative imagination and becomes the genesis or the antecedent for this novella. She also says that she is an obsessive revisionist. This novel alone underwent 50 different drafts. And the reason that she is such an obsessive revisionist is she resists writing an outline to a plot. She refuses to write to the method of an outline and to try to plot. She says, and I quote, "I don't believe in plot, and I've never plotted anything. I don't think you can be in the paragraph if you've already decided where you need to be," unquote. And I'm very drawn to that reference. I don't think you can be in the paragraph. And what is it for a writer to be in the paragraph? It suggests that one gives oneself as a conduit to the narrative that begins as an image in one's imagination, and that one simply leans into that image and endows that image with a will and lets it carry one. And so one finds oneself in the paragraph. And that suggests, I think, a very organic, very authentic approach to presenting the perspective of this young girl. She also, we know, writes without notes. She writes scenes in longhand. It's not until she feels that she has actually entered into the protagonist's point of view, that then she will go from longhand to the computer. But she says that the note-taking stage and the drafting stage alone takes years. We also know from our study of Small Things Like These that she avoids lengthy dialogue and exposition, and the reason she is resistant to extended dialogue, as she says, it's out of respect for her characters. Her characters, as she describes them, are reticent. They are quite reserved. They are unwilling to divulge or to disclose what is affecting them. And she says, and I quote, "It's not just that a character goes into the narrative reluctantly. I too go into it with reluctance. I am very reluctant to go into anyone's privacy, and that's one of the reasons I find writing difficult," unquote. Exposing the feelings of her characters, she prefers not to assume more than a limited, restricted omniscience as the narrator, creator. And she says that she thinks all good writing, and I quote, is good manners. Interesting, is it not? And what I think that demonstrates on her part as the one who is creating these characters and being in the paragraph with them is that she sees them as full, complex, intricate, three-dimensional individuals. Yes, she is drawing them on the page from her imagination, but she very much is incarnating them and respecting them and allowing them to move about, not on the page, in the world. And she adopts a rather tentative point of view, that she is not one who is omniscient. It is, for the writer, limited omniscience at the very best. She's able to tell a story in a paragraph or to compress a novel into a few thousand words, 92 pages, which would take me 400 pages to write the introduction. I spend a lot of time in the paragraphs. There's such a precision in her gaze to what she notices, and we see how very precise the young girl's gaze is, the details that she observes through her sense of sight. And Keegan's stories often hinge upon the unspoken tensions that fester between neighbors, parents, children, husbands, wives. And while there is this unspoken tension festering, this festering is also occurring against a greater festering, I would argue, in the political scene of Ireland. We know this story occurs in 1981. There is that wonderful moment when the young girl is introduced in the Kinsella home to a gathering of men and women playing cards, having fellowship, and before they retire for the evening, they also watch the news. You see how her perspective is going beyond a very provincial, parochial angle as she's learning about events in the world. And there's that glancing allusion, and it is just that. It is a mere glancing allusion to one of the strikers dying. So we know that the year is 1981, a hunger strike of 66 days when 10 political prisoners being held in Northern Ireland conduct a hunger fast and die. And it's perhaps a reference to the martyrdom of Bobby Sands. So there is this tension festering in the greater political landscape that then is also reflected within the domestic landscape as well. But as we know, just as in Small Things Like These, when Keegan represents in that novella the collusion between church and state, never does she descend into the polemical. She sees herself as a storyteller, not as an editorialist. And I think that's also suggestive of her education when she leaves Ireland and comes to America, to Louisiana, to study with the Jesuits at Loyola. She studies literature and she studies political science. And we see those two currents very evident in a close reading of her work, but never does the political assume primacy over the tension that festers within the family unit. Comments or questions at this interval? Yes?
I heard this, you probably know the quotation better than I do, but someone said they could not become a writer because to be a writer, you have to be honest and tell the truth, and you also have to be respectful and not embarrass people, therefore I can't be a writer. It's more succinct than that.
Well, I think what Keegan also has shown us, and how her craft is revealed to us, that she never assumes the role of a professor of morals or of that of a judge condemning. She resists the didactic, she resists the sentimental, she resists in any way moralizing. We draw inferences, and our sensibilities very much come into the contractual relationship between ourselves, our imagination, our upbringing, and the story that we encounter. But she has an incredible gift of knowing when to lay down the pen. She writes to a final period, but it's not a final period in the actual narrative of the story itself. She knows her limitation. She knows when to draw the curtain. In an act of revelation, she draws back the curtain, revelare. She reveals the story of this young girl's family and the Kinsellas, and then she knows when to withdraw, when her work is done. Yes, literally on the page there is the final period, but we do not know what happens the moment after the young girl utters "Daddy." This is an education novel, Bildungsroman. It's the education of a young girl. By virtue of these experiences, she becomes quite learned in the human condition. She learns that there is a meaning of home, a meaning of the parents beyond that what is literally known to her. If we think of this as an education novel, I think it's an education that's most revealed in her speech. She refers to her father, who is named Dan, the diminutive. She refers to him as Da. Whenever she is thinking, she refers to him as father, the formal term of address. When she addresses him, it's Da. She also is inclined to say yeah, but Mrs. Kinsella says to her that the proper word is yes. And when she returns home from the fosterage, she answers a question yes, and that arrests her mother's attention. But her education, I think, is perhaps evident by her language, by her vocabulary. Yeah, yes, da, da, and then daddy. From the abbreviated to the two syllables and the term of endearment, not father, but daddy, which she utters for the first time. And then Keegan brings down the curtain. And we are left, the ending is not one that is resolute. There is no sense of closure, which I find such a curious word. The other day I was waiting to go into a film at the Bell Court, and the people that were coming out of the earlier showing, some were talking, and they said, "Oh, I'm so disappointed. I wanted closure." I'm not sure what that means. I don't know that the human condition is ever closed, but Keegan certainly does not feel that it's incumbent upon her as a writer to give us that nice sense of the story ending. God's in heaven, all's right with the world, and tomorrow's another day. No, we do not know. She writes of tension. She writes us into a tension. The father is inebriated, and he is coming down the path with a walking stick. She is embraced by John, and out of her peripheral vision sees the advancement of her father. And when she says daddy, she has never called her biological father daddy. The antecedent of daddy is John. And it's as if in this incredible cinematographic moment, the frame freezes. And that's how I would describe her writing. It is cinematographic. She draws moving pictures. And in that final scene, which has an incredible amount of movement within it, the frame freezes. And we do not know what the next moment will bring.
Just like that last book, I want to know what happened.
Yes. Yes, yes. You know,
It may not be good, it may be good.
and see, and again, I think that is Keegan's way of saying, without apology or embarrassment, I don't know because I can't know. I can't know because I want to resist descending into a sentimental, moralistic, didactic tone of writing. Because if she did, she would become exactly like the individuals who have judged Bill and reduced his identity to an adjective. And so she's very much, I think, resisting becoming like the characters whom she's representing. That does that stand to reason, Connie?
Yeah, and doesn't she want the reader to have some thoughts?
Yes.
Wondering.
Yes, I think it's another way of her.
Ideas of their own.
Yes, it's her way of honoring the intelligence of the reader. I think she, as a writer, as a literary artist, she interprets her role somewhat contractually. She's chiseling out of the rough contours and textures of the human condition. She is liberating this scene from the life of this young girl, but that's her role, creator, liberator, not interpreter. Writers show. They do not explain. They do not interpret. That is not the responsibility of the artist. It is to create and to give. And as Alice Walker says, I do not know how other people see me. I only hope they do their best. So, yes, John?
This might be teeing you up for, I think, a good and deep conversation about writing and maybe reality. So take a step back if you don't want to go that way. But, you know, if someone heard Keegan's own report of how she writes, what her craft is, I could imagine someone saying to her, and maybe you could respond in her voice or wherever this takes you, you know, Miss Keegan, it seems like you actually think that your characters are real.
And shouldn't they be? I mean, you know, I go back, John, to O'Connor, who says that writing is an incarnational art. And if you don't like getting dusty, then you shouldn't write because it's not a grand enough job for you. I think believing them to be real, three-dimensional, sitting beside you, going into the paragraph with them, is a way of drawing them very credibly, not making them abstract, not making them an archetype, not making them caricature, two-dimensional, cardboard. It's letting them breathe. It's giving them breath, but then letting them breathe on their own. Does that?
So continuing, you know, my play acting, but you're just figuring out what you want them to do and writing that down, right? They don't make any decisions.
Oh, but they do. Oh, but they do. You know, the writer draws them into existence, endows them with the will, and then releases them and observes them. When Flannery O'Connor was writing Good Country People, she was once asked, did you know that charlatan Bible salesman, Manly Pointer, was going to steal Hulga's prosthetic leg? And she said, and I quote, I knew it 12 lines before I wrote it. So I think, to your point, John, that the artist doesn't approach these characters with this sense of separation, but really moves with them. And that's a difficult relationship. Does that?
Yes. I think any artist in any medium who approaches craftsmanship has that strange discovery that this has been pre-thought, but not by me. There is a reality here in the granite that I'm chiseling, or the poem that's trying to speak through me. The Greeks talked about the muses as being these entities that, but I think with our modern sensibilities, we tend not to think that way, that there is this realm of the real that isn't like a table, but something far more ephemeral but no less real.
I'm studying O'Connor's influence upon Keegan. She's very much influenced by Flannery O'Connor, James Joyce, and Anton Chekhov. And O'Connor writes about how in the creative act there are surprises that a reader will announce for you that you didn't know. And so that's why I say I think that at best a writer can have a limited omniscience, but can't be godlike omniscient and know. You can do that, but then your characters become stick figures that you move about, I think, that you don't allow them to move and to surprise you. So, and Keegan very much, I think, allows herself for such surprises. I think she approaches the narrative, the chisel's in her hand, but she holds it tentatively, I would argue, and slowly, and not that I've got a deadline that I've got to meet this commission and I've got to get this image cut. So, and that's why we had to wait 12 years to get this novella. Beth?
So to me, it speaks a lot to humility on a writer's part, but also, I just thought of this, the great love, this kind of falling in love with a human being.
Yes.
And letting that human being be who they are, and live into it almost themselves. That seems like a really otherworldly thing to do to me.
Well, I would argue and agree with you that yes, it is that humility. It's that posture of admitting I don't know and I can't know. And I think Keegan, as a writer, is a very charitable writer. When we read Small Things Like These, the Mother Superior is an agent of this collusion. But what we have to remember is she wasn't born that way, she became that way. So I think Keegan is always asking herself, how does this character become this person that I have chiseled? I think of the young girl's father, who he's a gambler. He is not what we think of as a generous provider for the family. He gambles. When he returns in the final scene, he's not willing to sit down and eat because he's had a liquid meal, as he says. But he wasn't born that way. So I think, in her own sanctified imagination, she's encouraging us also to keep in mind that this person has become this because of circumstances that I may not tell you in the course of the narrative, because that would be a digression from the structural unity of the work, and that's another narrative. But at the same time, that tentativeness and that charitable attitude of her as a writer, which I think encourages us, in turn, to be charitable readers as well. Does that support what you were thinking, Beth? And you're right. that is not easy, because editors and publishers don't always understand that tentativeness. Yes?
The girl herself expresses that at a couple of points.
Uh-huh.
She says when the dad's about to leave, I'm in a spot where I can neither be what I always am nor turn into what I could be.
Yes. Yes.
So rich.
So it is. So she's in this posture of a possible evolution, is she not? Which occurs in her education as well. She's referred to, as I said 3 times, as petal, which is a single part of the whole. It's fragile, it's delicate, but it's a part of a blooming. And that's what we see her. This, I think if there were a subtitle, this would become The Education of the Unnamed Protagonist as she blooms in the summer of 1981. But of course, even though she is blooming and becoming, given Keegan's tenacious hold on realism, she returns to a setting that you and I know by inference is not one that is hospitable toward the blooming. Yes, she has a standing invitation to return, but yet, the summer ends, the next school year is beginning, and she returns into a setting, and her sisters look at her as though she's an English cousin, which, given the Irish sensibility, is not the most generous of terms, I should think. But this sense of present yet not fully integrated as a result of having become educated. Her speech has changed. She's dressed differently. Her sisters look at her more not in familial terms, but as a distant cousin, if not object. And that's where we end, you see. But that tenacious hold onto realism. Keegan says that if there is a guiding ethos in her writing, it's her willingness to leave certain things unsaid. It allows her to adhere to the efficiency of the properties of the subgenre of a short story, long short story, novella, but at the same time, that's what guides her writing, that she doesn't feel that it's morally incumbent upon her to tell all. Mildred does that for us in this novel, right? It is Mildred. For Keegan, she says, to be tactful is to say more than enough. If there is a manner to which Keegan tries to adhere, it is being tactful. She refers often to a letter that Anton Chekhov wrote, and he defines grace. And Chekhov says that grace is the ability to complete an action with the fewest number of movements and without calling attention to oneself. To complete an act with the fewest number of movements. Graceful, gracious. And I think her prose is lyrical and graceful. And to be tactful, to say only what is necessary. Mildred, whom we meet, is she not, the embodiment of tactlessness. She really is the counterpoint, I would argue, to Keegan's ethos as a writist. Mildred, she is the personification of tactlessness, who goes to the wake only to observe and to report all of the details from her perspective. The number of people who were there, the sandwiches, and the fact that they had a plastic rosary and that he was lying in the coffin crooked and unshaven. I mean, so much for paying one's respects to the dead, correct? You know, and then it is she. Interestingly, in this novella, it is on two occasions when the language is inappropriate. One is spoken by an unnamed woman who asks Edna who this young girl is, and condescendingly says, well, maybe it's like having a child. And of course that refers to the loss of their son. That, you know, it's condescending, it's patronizing. I mean, there's a duality in this novella. You know, there is in the Kinsella home the antithesis of what the young girl has known. That's a part of her lived experiences. But never does Keegan allow the duality to converge. She keeps it as these opposing tensions. There, you know, she experiences for the first time home. She returns to a house, one might say, figuratively speaking. But what she also discovers is that even within the fellowship that occurs within the setting where the Kinsellas live, it's not ideal, it's not idyllic. You know, what Keegan is showing us is, she says of this novel, as she once replied in an interview, and in her interview she is as reticent as her characters are. She says that it's a study in the toxicity of family, that families can be awful places. And I find that interesting that the unit, the family, she refers to as a place, but she also argues they can be lovely places as well. She doesn't take one side over the other. She lives in that ambiguity, in that tension, in that antithetical design that she has constructed. But Mildred and the other unnamed women, it is they who use the inappropriate language. And the first reference is one that we could not even describe euphemistically because it's merely a changing of two vowels. It is Mildred who uses the one incident of inappropriate language. I mean, she is a study in inappropriateness, is she not? You know, the way that she goes to the wake, the motive is one that is inappropriate. It's not to pay respect to the dead, it's merely to observe and to gossip. And then she subjects this young girl to this barrage of these staccato questions, and then feels that it's morally incumbent upon her to disclose the tragedy that the Kinsellas have been predeceased by their son. Now, I think Keegan here is inviting us, not that she herself will allow herself to become moralistic, but we as readers certainly do question this, do we not, in terms of its appropriateness, feeling that it's incumbent upon her to disclose the truth. Remember when we read some years ago Ibsen's play The Wild Duck? And there is this character who feels that it is, as we say in the South, hell for leather incumbent upon him to tell the truth to an innocent 13-year-old girl who is incapable of understanding the truth. The same is true of this young girl. She is incapable of comprehending this. She is beginning to see that, yes, she's wearing a boy's clothes, and the room in which she is sleeping is appointed as a young boy's room. There are trains, but there are no tracks. There is a young boy throughout the design of the wallpaper, and she begins to observe him and to feel compassion for that young boy in all of the different turns that he's represented. But what we see in her character is how very sensitive, how observant, how very perceptive, how very keen she is. And then you have character Mildred thinking that it's incumbent upon her to tell the truth because the truth will set you free. I think that's Keegan's way of indicting a platitude. Flannery O'Connor said, know the truth, it'll make you odd. It'll make you odd. So, Yes, Mildred, the embodiment of inappropriateness. So just as foster becomes multivalent, so does inappropriate. It's not enough just to say that the language is inappropriate. Everything she does is inappropriate. But it's John who intercedes and turns this into what we would call a teaching, learning moment. When he learns that the truth has been disclosed. You know, and I think it's really interesting semantically, linguistically, how when Edna tells the young girl that there are no secrets in this house. And I think what Keegan is very much inviting us to consider is the word secret. And what is it to tell a secret? And what are the effects of telling the secret? What is the motive behind telling the secret? Or not telling it. And this is why we describe Keegan's craft as the art of subtraction, the motif of absence, exactly, of not telling. It's a question of, is the person to whom the truth is going to be disclosed capable of comprehending this? This young girl has just come into this setting. This is beyond her comprehension intellectually and emotionally. And what Mildred does is quite an assault upon the sensibilities of this young girl. But yet, John, in hearing of the disclosure, in the role of a teacher, takes her outside and they walk to the shoreline. And all the young girl knows is that England's over there. But yet it's along the water, which begins with two lights that they observe. And they remove their shoes. And he has scored her shoes because he knows that she might be inclined to slip and fall. It's what the African-American poet Robert Hayden would describe as an office of love. Office in the liturgical devotional sense, a small room of love, if you will, scoring her shoes, but taking her away from Edna and to tell her, and I quote when he says to her, "You don't have to say anything. Always remember that that's a thing you never need to do. Many the man's lost much because he missed the perfect opportunity to say nothing." That's the lesson that the teacher, Daddy, imparts to her. That there are occasions which do not require elucidation, explanation, interpretation, that reserve is a virtue. And in the end, the truth is that she herself is almost drowned. And she has caught a cold that has delayed her return. And the question is, why do you have this chill, this cold? And she doesn't tell. She's mastered the lesson in her youth, because if she were perhaps to tell what has happened, that could perhaps jeopardize her being able to return for another visit. So what is imparted here in the lesson is that yes, reserve, that one does not have to disclose all that one knows, that one has to be very careful in one's words because words matter. And once they're spoken, they're irrevocable. All that Mildred has said cannot be reclaimed. It's irrevocable. It's expressed, and it's now a part of her experiences. But yet, John helps put this all in perspective. And even saying that Edna didn't mean to allow this to happen, that Edna tries to see the good in all people, even Mildred. So, Fred, I think your hand is up. Is that correct?
Yeah,
Yes.
What struck me about his description of her description of the sea was it was very witness hissing, and it happens right after she. So there are no secrets, but the great paradox, of course, is there is a secret,
Yes.
right? And that this child who, to me, is almost Christological. In terms of the only son,
Yes.
right, who dies.
Yes.
And she's now just sort of one way of sort of picking on someone's body is to wear their clothes. Right? So she didn't wear any clothes. So this body like of Christ that she has taken on. So they go after this great revelation of this death. They go to the sea, kind of like Whitman goes to the sea.
Yes.
Which to him whispers death. But to him is also sort of a rebirth. In him, the creative voice and the poet is born from the sea which is whispering to him death. And so I just find it curious that right after this they go to the sea and sort of the notions of death.
The water is a wonderful paradoxical symbol in that it's the feminine symbol of life. Our conception occurs in the first 9 months of our lives within water. It's a symbol of rebirth, of rejuvenation, but it's the same element that in another mood can claim life. It has that wonderful ambiguity or that paradoxical effect, certainly. The lights that shine upon the water initially are 2, and in the end there are 3. And only her footprints are remaining on the shoreline. And John says, "You must have carried me." And what's wonderful in her education is that she's beginning to hear and to understand and respond to humor and to jokes. What we infer is from her home setting, there is no humor. I mean, everything is probably treated like a joke, but not in the sense of a joke that's good-natured and good humor. But she's beginning to develop this understanding of the jovial. John is both biologically avuncular, uncle, but at the same time, he really becomes more of the paternal figure. When the 3 lights then shine upon the water, and only her footprints remain in the sand, and he puts her shoes on her before he puts his on, and then he gathers her into his arm, and the bonding is sealed. The bonding occurs at night on the shore, the sand and the water and the moonlight. It's sealed. When she is first touched by Edna, she remarks that this is the first time that she can remember being held, that her father has never touched her. Touch figures prominently throughout the entire novella. And when John and Edna hold her, she wishes they wouldn't, because she knows that this will not last forever. And the question then becomes, would it have been better never to have known the joy and the tactile sensation of being touched and held, or not to know it? That's how Keegan is showing us her depth, her emotional maturity, her sensitivity as we go into her thoughts. How are we doing on time?
About there.
About there? Okay. Well, let me conclude this part by giving you some questions to consider for our next discourse, if I may. And then I want to hear any other questions you may have as well. I want you to consider in preparation for next week why in the novella the protagonist is never named. We do not even know her exact age. We do not know the exact number of siblings that she has. When we meet her mother is with child. The child is delivered during the course of the summer months. We do not know the exact number of siblings or members of her family. We do not know her name. I want you to consider, imagine the artistic effects of that and why we would not argue that this is on the part of the writer an aesthetic omission. I'd also like for you to consider why the tense of this narrative remains in the present tense. It begins in the summer months of the end of a school year, the beginning of another, in 1981. It's the year of the Great Trouble in Ireland, the hunger strikes. But the narrator, the young girl, unnamed, tells us this story consistently in the present tense. What is the effect of that? Consider those questions. I have a lot more, but I think I'll give you that for homework, okay? Any questions or observations based on today's discourse? Yes, Bob?
I love the the whole focus of the education of Pella.
Yes.
And there's another whole part of the education which I was fascinated with, and that's the sports education,
Oh, yes.
where he's getting her to run.
Yes.
That was
Yes.
really powerful. And his way of doing that.
And characteristic of the Bildungsroman, the education novel, is that it doesn't set out to be that. It's not as if Keegan considers, I'm going to write out of the Gaelic tradition a Bildungsroman. If that had been her approach, it would have been that, but it would have been so methodical. This is what we say about it, because in the tradition of the Bildungsroman, the protagonist who will acquire this education doesn't set out to acquire it. It merely happens by virtue of experience. It's a story of an initiation with a succession of epiphanal moments, if you will. And what is learned in this context is not what one would write on an examination, whereby one would be promoted to the next form in the European education system. This becomes an education in love.
A whole different definition of homeschooling.
Yes, indeed, indeed, yes, yeah. It's a master class in child narration and in homeschooling, yes. And what I'm also going to argue is how Keegan re-images, not reimagine, but re-images the parable of the prodigal son. When she returns, her father, who only refers to her as child and in the second person pronoun you, the actual study of names and nomenclature is incredible in this work. The father refers to her child and you. When she returns, the prodigal child. And in that final scene, there are behaviors that are recounted in the Lucan gospel of running. Yeah. So it's not so much reimagining, it's re-imaging it. And I say re-image because of how cinematographic the moving pictures, I think, is a re-imaging of that. And we're going to discuss that as well. So, yes?
It reminds me of To Kill a Mockingbird, where Scout tells the whole story, and these images and things just happen.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. In many ways, this novella, this long short story, it's somewhat like a dramatic monologue. We have one narrator. We have a monologuist, the unnamed girl, who is telling us this from her perspective, from her sensory experiences. She tells us what she has heard. And she tells us that even though these events have occurred in the present tense. And I think Keegan is making a profound psychological, theological statement in adopting that technique as well. Well, I hope this is, oh, Connie?
I just, and this may be just kind of a weird question, but what was a person, the reason for that hand coming out of the water?
Oh.
Pointing her hand out there?
Yeah.
I thought,
Oh, well, the question is it?
scared me to death.
The question is it? I mean,
It couldn't be, but
yeah. Given how very dangerous this is, and the water has risen higher because as she goes over the stile, she doesn't descend as many steps as they had in her first time there. I mean, there's such an innocence in that she, in her sensitivity, now that John is not able to do the milking because he has to go assist with the delivery of another farm animal, Edna assumes the role in the dairy, and she, in her sensitivity, thinks that she wants to do something for them because they've done so much for her, and she thinks, I can go and get the water so Edna won't have to go. And yet, when she goes and takes the bucket and the water is higher, I think that what is accompanying her here in her intensity to get this done and to accomplish this task, that her imagination perhaps is very, very active, Because the setting is not the same as it was in her introduction to the well.
right.
Yeah. And, but at the same time, characteristic of Keegan's writing is that one of her great gifts is that she has kept the Gaelic folkloric tradition alive. What William Butler Yeats helped to initiate, Keegan keeps it alive. And she embeds in her stories, if you read from the collection of Antarctica or the other collection, Walk the Blue Fields, characteristic of her craft is that she will take a myth from Gaelic antiquity and retell it or re-image it in a contemporary situation. So there is that fanciful moment, if you will. It's possible, certainly.
It's just maybe what she was afraid
Yeah.
was going to happen.
Well, and it, literally, I think falling into the well is because she doesn't understand the water has reached a certain height as it was in their initial gathering of the water. But even in that possible tragedy, she realizes that this is an opportunity to put in place the lesson that John has imparted to her, and she doesn't tell. They leave, her mother asks her, and she doesn't tell the truth. And of course that begs the question, is she withholding information? Is she telling a falsehood? No, exactly.
It wasn't important.
Yeah, right, exactly.
It's time to be quiet.
It's time to be quiet, to exercise that reserve. Yeah, that's the education of the young girl. There is a film version of this that has been made. It was Ireland's entry this past season in the international awards competition. It's called The Quiet Girl.
Have you seen it? Is it worth it?
Oh, yes. Yes, yeah. It's available on Amazon. Yeah, try Amazon. When it was first brought out as a DVD, it was for European machines, and of course, foolish me, wanting a copy as soon as I could get it, ordered one that doesn't even play on an American machine.
You can frame it.
I can, right, exactly. If I ever go to Europe, I'll take it with me, But it's now available in American format. It is a very faithful telling of the work. The one license that is taken is that they give her a name.
Oh, see, that seems significant.
Yeah, they actually give her a name as they converse with her. But other than that, it's a very faithful telling of the story itself. And it's beautifully filmed. And it's narrated partly in Gaelic and part in British English as well. Yeah, with subtitles, yeah. And another thing we're going to study, and I promise I'll be quiet, fosterage, in the context in which Keegan is representing it, is very much in keeping with the practice of fosterage in medieval Irish Gaelic law before Ireland is completely taken over by English law. Fosterage was, it was an unwritten law, but it was a part of the Brennan laws of ancient Ireland. And Keegan brings that into this narrative as well in her representation of fostering. This is not just fostering a child because of economic hardships. Fostering, just like legitimate, is going to become for us multivalent. Foster as feeding, foster as nourishment, foster as tutelage. This is more than just a temporary residing with the aunt and uncle who are of better economic means. So she very much, if you will, abolishes a very literal, denotative, contemporary understanding of fosterage and takes us back into the etymology of it as well in ancient Irish law. I'll see you next week. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.